Hi, I'm Scott Allard, Daniel J. Evans Endowed Professor of Social Policy at the Evans School of Public Policy and Governance. And I'd like to welcome you to a panel session today hosted by the Evans School called Understanding Social and Economic Factors of Social Infrastructure. Given the events of the last few years, many things are changing in our political, economic, and social lives. This panel provides cutting-edge research to help us understand some of these changes, from the racial reckoning and social response that pulled down Confederate statues to changes in the workforce and contracting practices during COVID and in recent years. There will be 3 presentations today, and I'll introduce the speakers here at the outset and then let them share their work in turn. First, Ines Jurcevic is an assistant professor at the Evans School of Public Policy and Governance, whose work in the fields of social psychology and public policy pushes our thinking on stereotyping, discrimination, and diversity in modern organizational structures. She'll present a talk entitled On the Removal of Confederate Monuments and White Americans' Support for Racial Equity. Next, Ben Brunges, also an assistant professor at the Evans School with expertise in federal management and contracting, will present a talk entitled Equitable Contracting, the Performance of Federal Procurement Preference Programs. And closing out the session today will be Dafeng Zhu, also an assistant professor at the Evans School, whose research focuses on urban policy, immigration, and the social and economic history of the US. He'll present a talk entitled The Decline in Foreign-Born Workers and Changes to the US Labor Market During the COVID-19 Pandemic. With that, I'll turn it over to Ines.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Scott. Let me go ahead and share my screen. All right, so hi everybody. I'm delighted to be a part of this panel and to have this opportunity to share with you some recent work I've been doing in collaboration with Sophie Trauwalter at the University of Virginia. And this work looks at the consequences of the removal of Confederate monuments and symbols. And in particular, I'll be presenting some preliminary data on this topic, looking at Americans' downstream support for racial equity policies as a function of decisions made around the removal or maintenance of Confederate monuments. So to begin, I want to talk a little bit about the importance of symbolic acts. In recent years, there's been symbolic acts done in the name of social justice, and these have been prevalent in both the public and private sector. These include in the private sector, companies blacking out their social media pages for Black Lives Matter. And in the public sector, we can think about the removal of Confederate monuments from esteemed public spaces by local governments. And these symbolic acts can be meaningful. They can signal institutional norms and social values, but they do not in and of themselves constitute structural change. In fact, they are oftentimes low cost and low investment initial changes that require additional substance to them. And the presentation I'll be sharing with you today examines how these presentations, this presentation examines how framing of these symbolic acts can shape future policy prioritization. And I'll be doing so in the context of Confederate monuments. So first I want to take a moment to orient you to the prevalence of these monuments. There are over 1,500 in the US, and they range from the expected South all the way to the Pacific Northwest. They include statues, flags, holidays, names of schools, military bases, and other public works. And many of these are in prominent display in major cities, like the former Monument Avenue in Richmond, Virginia, while others are lesser known. And if we look at when monuments were commemorated, they started being dedicated by Confederate family members following the Civil War. But there are also a couple key points in US history where we see spikes, namely in the early part of the 1900s under Jim Crow, as well as during the Civil Rights Movement era. So one can clearly begin to recognize why some consider these symbols and markers of history, while others see them as markers of hatred, interpersonal and institutional racism. And this heritage versus hate frame that we often see emphasizes and guides us to specific questions, namely questions and conversations around whether or not to remove the symbols of the Confederacy. And narratives emerge that either align the belief that these should be removed because they represent hatred, while others believe that they should be maintained because they represent a community's history. And these conversations are often heated and get contentious quite quickly. There are also conversations that are close to home. I began this research during my time at the University of Virginia, and the year I arrived, a city commission committee was deciding what to do with the statue of Robert E. Lee in downtown Charlottesville. And as this project has unfolded, so has the situation in Charlottesville. And as many of you know, things came to a head when white supremacists organized a rally which resulted in violence and death. And I mention this to underscore the significance behind symbolic acts like the removal of monuments from public spaces. But these conversations have largely focused on whether these are symbols of hatred or heritage from the past and their modern echoes. We haven't yet grappled with the future. How do current changes to these symbols, their removal, their maintenance, how do those shape future efforts to promote racial equity in particular? And that's where our work comes in. We became interested in the consequences of community decisions around Confederate monuments for future prioritization of racial equity policies. And so today I'll be sharing with you some work examining how community decisions for what to do with monuments shapes individuals' expectations on the extent to which communities should prioritize racial equity in the future, and the extent to which people think that they will prioritize equity in the future. Now, we've conducted several experiments to this effect, and the benefit of using experiments is that allow us to put people in specific situations and see how those situations will shape their decision-making. I'll be sharing with you a general study design that is relevant to many of the experiments I'll be highlighting today, and after that, I'll be sharing with you some initial data. So in our studies, participants were told that they'd be reading about contemporary news issues and then providing their reactions to those current events. The study manipulation was delivered in the form of a newspaper article, as seen here. Now, the research team created this article, but the content was based on actual news reporting and real-world articles and content. And across these conditions, the initial paragraphs highlighted that communities were dealing with a difficult decision of what to do with Confederate symbols and memorabilia. The articles then went on to profile 3 communities that had either chosen to keep, remove, or were undecided about what to do with these monuments. Now, in some experiments, these cities are taken from actual communities and their real-world decisions on how to handle these memorabilia, while in other cases, we used fictional communities to help address some stereotypes individuals might have about the types of communities or characteristics of communities that choose to keep or remove monuments. Now, after reading these articles that profiled 3 communities, and I want to note that participants read only one of these. So they read only about communities keeping, or only removing, or only those that were undecided. After doing so, they provided their perceptions of what should be prioritized in the future around policies. And these participants completed the same set of measures twice, but with different guiding instructions. The first measure was looking at perceptions of the extent to which communities will prioritize institutional policies. And these included questions that were focused on racial equity, for example, allocating funds away from workplace diversity initiatives, which we reverse code, or developing an appreciation for multicultural communities. A second set of items looked at prioritization of non-racial equity policies, those that are not explicitly related to racial equity, including increasing or maintaining revenue or promoting volunteering opportunities for adults. Next, participants answered these same questions, this time framed as the extent to which communities should prioritize these policies. And this allows us to get at this discrepancy between what individuals think communities should be doing, what should be priorities, and whether they think communities will meet the moment and do what they should. I'll be today sharing with you primarily research and data looking at the promotion or prioritization of racial equity policies. To foreshadow a little bit, we find no effect of non-racial equity policies. And so there's nothing about these symbolic acts around social injustice that shape prioritization of non-equity related policies, but we do see evidence that they shape racial equity prioritization. So first, to orient you to the graph, along the x-axis, we have the 3 conditions that participants were randomly assigned to, either keeping, removing, or undecided on monuments. Here, the y-axis is the extent to which people think that these policies should be prioritized. Higher numbers indicate greater prioritization. First, I'll highlight for you the extent to which people think these policies should be prioritized, namely racial equity policies. And we find that across the board, our participants felt that racial equity policies should be priorities to communities in the future. Now, interestingly, when we look at the extent to which individuals feel these communities will prioritize racial equity, we find a different pattern. We find that for communities keeping or undecided on monuments, our white participants felt that communities will not do as much as they should to prioritize equity in the future. However, for those communities that had removed monuments, this simple symbolic act led individuals to anticipate that the community would now align future policies to promote racial equity, even absent evidence to suggest that this was the case. And I do want to highlight a few additional findings that help support this work. First, the data I just shared with you focus on white Americans' responses. we have evidence to suggest that Black Americans' perceptions of future racial equity prioritization are less influenced by these symbolic acts. First, I want to show you the data looking at white participants, which we replicate in this study, and then I'll share with you the patterns for self-identified Black Americans. So for our white participants, we replicate the same finding, namely that the removal of Confederate monuments leads individuals to perceive that communities will prioritize equity as much as they should. However, for our Black participants, we do not find the same pattern. In fact, what we find is that they consistently feel that communities should prioritize equity more than they think that they will following these symbolic acts. And this begins to highlight the important gap that emerges here, with white Americans being relatively more convinced by symbolic acts absent substantive change compared to our Black American participants. And particularly for our Black American participants, there might be a greater awareness of and historical evidence to suggest that these symbolic changes do not strongly correlate with structural ones. Now, in additional data, we looked at profiling specific communities and their recent work around addressing disparities, and looked at the desire for our participants to see more, to have trust in the communities to address these disparities, as well as accountability. In particular, we profiled communities such as the example here was Charlotte, North Carolina, which had recently had a report and filed a disparity study looking at the government's contracting and procurement practices for women and minority-owned businesses, noting a disparity there in that there was under-contracting for these individuals, for these communities. And so we then examined the extent to which participants trusted Charlotte to address these disparities and hold this community accountable as a function of whether they had first read that Charlotte was keeping or removing monuments. And what we find is that for white Americans who prioritize racial equity, they trust this community to address these disparities when they're removing monuments compared to keeping them. And for our white Americans who deprioritize racial equity, they desired less government accountability to ensure that these disparities were addressed in the future. So taken together, these symbolic acts can undercut the momentum of what communities are trying to accomplish in their pursuit of equity. You can lose people because they think the work is done. So then the question becomes, how do you sustain change? How do you frame these symbolic acts in a way that sustains efforts? In one study, we examined the effect of progress and commitment frames for monument removal and their influence on racial equity prioritization. And here our participants were white participants and non-white participants, randomly assigned to either read about this removal of Confederate monuments as a symbol of progress, of how far we had come towards addressing racial injustice, and in the spirit of how far we had come, the removal of these monuments was a marker of that progress. Now, this is a common narrative that you see within news media and articles examining the removal of Confederate monuments. Other participants were randomly assigned to read about commitment, namely that these monuments should be removed as a commitment of how far we still have to go towards addressing racial injustice. And in the spirit of how much we have to do, they should be removed in the name of future work in progress. So either thinking about how far we have come or how far we still have to go to address injustice. So looking at the data patterns for that, what I want to highlight for you here is that for our white participants who read about the removal of monuments as a symbol of progress, a common narrative that we see, they feel that more is currently being done to address racial equity and that less should be done in the future. In contrast, our participants who read about their removal as a symbol of our commitment to addressing future racial injustice, they felt that less was currently being done than needed to be done in the future. Now, for our non-white participants, similar to the initial data I shared with you, there's a consistent belief that more should be done than what is currently being done. And here I want to highlight that the commitment frames for both groups of participants bring everyone to the table, feeling that more should be done than is currently being done under the context of commitment. So to summarize, we find that symbolic acts can shape future policy prioritization, in particular undermining related future efforts. So the extent to which symbolic acts now signal social justice, individuals perceive that the future will hold those same values, in particular white Americans do. We find that these symbolic acts, when framed correctly, can build momentum, as is the case in commitment frames. And ultimately highlight that with proper, thoughtful framing, you can build shared perspectives and momentum towards future equity efforts, building structure behind the symbols. Thank you very much, and I'll end it there.
All right. Well, my name is Ben Brunges, and I'm an assistant professor at the Evans School. And this morning, I'm going to be talking with you a little bit about equity in federal contracting programs. And in this presentation in particular, we'll be thinking about procurement as a way to promote real structural change. So wherein this talks a little bit about symbolic change and the way that that affects broader changes in society. Here, the focus will be on the way that we can use contracting programs as a way to build real infrastructure. When we think about infrastructure here, I'm going to specifically be thinking about job creation, the creation of new firms, as well as investment in firms that are going to create and maintain parts of our traditional infrastructure. And because of this, despite its sort of unheralded impact, public procurement programs have had the largest impact of any public program on equity in practice. So before we get too far into the presentation, I want to make sure that we have an idea where we're going. First, I'll provide a little bit of context for what's going on in federal contracting. Then we'll get into the history of some of our preference programs in the federal government. We'll then discuss the four main programs that are being used today, and we'll talk a little bit about the ways that we might improve the performance of these equity programs. Before I get too deeply into it, some terms, because this is a technical space. The first is solicitation. And when I say the word solicitation, I mean the process by which the government goes about finding and negotiating contracts. So they solicit bids or solicit proposals, and that process of designing the proposal, negotiating with the vendors, advertising the bids, that's called solicitation. I'm also going to be using a term set aside, and set aside is a kind of contract in which only certain kinds of contractors may compete. So the important thing to recognize when we talk about set asides is that they're not uncompetitive contracts. Rather, it's just restricted to certain kinds of firms who can bid or submit proposals. Another term is preferred groups. I'll be using this today instead of disadvantaged groups because we have some groups within our federal contracting infrastructure that are preferred, but they're not necessarily disadvantaged. And so the four main programs we'll talk about are SBA 8A, Women-Owned Small Business Program, the Hub Zone program, as well as the Service Disabled Veteran-Owned Small Business Program. All these preference small businesses, 8A, Women-Owned Small Business, and Hub Zone are designed to promote buying with disadvantaged groups. The Disabled Veteran-Owned program, we could argue a little bit about whether that's about disadvantage or whether it's about rewarding someone for their service. And finally, another term I might use is period of performance. When I use that term, it's just about the duration of the contract, what's going on when the contractor is doing their work. So first of all, let's take a look at trends in federal spending on contracts. And here we see the end of the Bush administration, the span of the Obama administration, and the Trump administration. And you can see here that contracting at the federal level is big business. We're talking a low point of still nearly $500 billion in 2014, 2015 in the Obama administration, reaching up to a high point of over $1 trillion last year during the response to the coronavirus pandemic. We can see, in general, the trend here is that the federal spending on contracting is growing, and nearly always this is accounting for about 3 to 5% of our GDP. So this is big business. There are trends in terms of politics. You can see that Republican presidents tend to use contracts more than Democratic presidents, and if I were to draw this trend line out farther, you'd see the similar trends in previous administrations. But this is a big part of what the federal government does at this point. If you add together grant spending, contract spending, and spending on personnel, you account for more than 100% of the federal discretionary budget each year. So this is more than half of what the federal government is doing with their discretionary money. So in terms of these preferred groups, who are we spending our contracting dollars with? Well, the vast majority of our spending with preferred groups is with minority-owned businesses through the SBA 8A and Hub Zone programs. We then spend slightly less on women-owned businesses and on veteran-owned businesses. If we look at this as a proportion of all spending on overall contracting, about 20% or so of our federal spending on contracts is being allocated to preferred groups, and this is over the past 5 years. So how do we get to this point where we have these preference programs? Well, in 1953, the Small Business Act was passed, which allowed for the fair proportionment of contract dollars to be awarded or set aside to small businesses. And you'll notice that this does not specifically highlight racial, ethnic, gender-based groups, or even veteran-based groups, but rather the promotion of investment in small businesses. But with the rise of the Johnson administration and the greater welfare state, the Kerner Commission, in their report on how to improve conditions in disadvantaged communities around the country, noted that the disadvantaged need help in obtaining experience and creating for themselves a stake in the economic community. And one way that they suggested that the government do this is through the creation of set-aside programs or preferred group programs to ensure that we're specifically investing in the economies of urban areas, the economies of places where for generations people have been discriminated against and not provided access to the system. So in 1978, the SBA amended the Small Business Act, or pardon me, Congress amended the Small Business Act to include preferred groups, specifically those who have been subjected to racial or ethnic prejudice or cultural bias because of their identity as a member of a group without regard to their individual qualities. So this is the beginning of the SBA 8A program, which then grants preference to disadvantaged firms. And over time, we've seen challenges to this. And the first one came in 1980 in Fully Love versus Klesnick. And the Supreme Court at the time, the Berger Court, ruled that set-asides were a legitimate use of congressional power, specifically citing Congress's spending and commerce authority. So based on this, over the last 40 years or so, we've seen a growth in federal procurement equity programs. The first is the SBA 8A program, which is set aside for small businesses that are owned and controlled by one or more socially and economically disadvantaged group. And so when we think social disadvantage, this is primarily around a racial or ethnic construction. And economic disadvantages, there's a threshold that's defined. If the owner of the business has access to more than, I think today it's $750,000, then you don't qualify for SBA 8A. But if you have less than $750,000 as your net worth, you can qualify as an SBA 8A firm. We also have set-aside programs for woman-owned businesses. And these are small businesses that are economically disadvantaged. That is, they're women-owned and they're operated also by women. And this is a key component. We need to have 51% ownership by women, but also women need to be involved in the day-to-day management and long-term decision-making of the firm. Similar program for service-disabled veterans and veteran-owned businesses, which are also 51% owned and controlled by veterans with a service-connected disability. And there's a wide range of ways that they test to see whether the disability meets the threshold. And then finally, there's the Hub Zone program, and these are for businesses that are headquartered in historically underutilized business zones. So that is, the headquarters is in the spot that's listed on the map, but also 35% or more of the employees of the business live in the area designated on the map. So these are the four primary equity programs that we see being used at the federal level. Let's look a little bit deeper into the 8A and Hub Zone programs. So the 8A program, these are the specific racial and ethnic groups that have been designated within the program as socially disadvantaged. So we can see Black Americans, Hispanic Americans, Native Americans, including American Indians, Eskimos, Aleuts, and Native Hawaiians, a wide range of Asian Pacific American-owned firms, and then firms owned by people in this country from the subcontinent, India, Pakistan, and so on. So this is official documentation from the SBA outlining which kind of ownership counts as socially disadvantaged in our context. The 8A program also has a management and technical assistance program where the agency provides assistance for firms that are interested in participating. And here you can see that over time, the 8A 2.7J program, or the 7J program, has helped more businesses while spending less money doing it. So we see in 2010 about 3,500 businesses were helped at a cost of about $5.5 million. By 2019, more than 8,000 small businesses have been helped through this program at a cost of only $4.6 billion. So we're seeing some efficiency gains in terms of the ways that we're reaching out and connecting with our disadvantaged firms. The hub zone, this is an example of one of the maps that you might see if you're trying to think about where hub zone businesses might be located. Essentially, the colored spots on the map, the red, the light blue, and the darker gray, are census tracts that have been identified as places where the government wants to invest money in disadvantaged communities. And hub zone certified businesses get a 10% price evaluation in preference when they are participating in full and open contract competitions. And they can also participate in set-aside competitions. That is where the competition is excluded to only disadvantaged firms. Moving forward with this program, the map is currently frozen, but it's going to be remade this year. So for people in the Obama administration, there's a moment now where we're going to be seeing the growth and the change in this particular map. In recent years, there's a focus on adding rural census tracts as opposed to focusing on simply urban areas, which was the initial construction of this program. For firms that are interested in participating in this program, there is a guaranteed 10-year access period if you buy buildings and decide to start a business in one of these census designated tracts. So this is an area where I think that we're going to see a lot of change over the next coming years. But here we see Seattle. We can also look at the map, and as we would expect in Seattle, there's a grouping of these census tracts in the southern part of the city. You can also see an entire county off in the far eastern part of the state, which has been designated as a tract, and you can see some tribal land on here as well. This is the map for Washington, D.C., which, as you might expect, is heavily concentrated in Southeast Washington, D.C. and Prince George's County, with a little bit in South Arlington. And then here's the map for the entire United States, where these census designated tracts are located. And if you track this over time, you'll see that there are more red dots showing up in the Midwest than there were 20, 30 years ago. So in terms of performance, we set annual targets for the investment in these kinds of firms. And so on the left, we see the targets of overall, we want to spend about 23% on contracts with minority-owned, women-owned, and veteran-owned firms. And you can see that in the last 12 years or so, we haven't hit that target once. But we do hit it regularly for subsections of that target. So we hit it regularly for our minority-owned businesses and for our veteran-owned businesses. In recent years, I think we've hit it twice for women-owned businesses. But overall, we are not spending with our disadvantaged firms or our preferred groups as much as our targets would suggest. And there are a number of reasons why this is happening, and I'll talk about them in a moment. There have been, ever since the initial creation of these programs, there have been a series of challenges, beginning with Richmond versus Crossan in 1989 and extending out into Adirond versus Pena in 1995. And essentially, the Supreme Court has ruled in these cases that these programs are subject to strict scrutiny, that the government needs to have a compelling interest in ensuring that we're promoting equity in this context, and that the programs that we use to do it are narrowly tailored. And so we've seen, particularly among state and local governments, a continued trend of courts ruling against broad requirements to buy in this way. But if there is compelling evidence presented that the government previously acted in a discriminatory manner, and the program is narrowly tailored to address those previous missteps, then the courts have been generally supportive of these programs. In Adoran versus Pena, it's worth noting the court ruled that even proof of past injury does not in itself establish the suffering of present or future injury. So despite the broader trend in society to think about equity in a certain way, the courts are still applying this kind of a standard. We need to be very careful about the way that we present our equity programs. At the state level, we've also seen evidence that race neutrality maintains popular support. And so two of the more liberal states in the United States, California in 1996 and Washington in 1999, both banned affirmative action programs, including procurement programs. And both of them in the last 2 years held statewide referenda, which were turned down. So that is to reintroduce affirmative action. So depending on context, it's pretty clear that if we take these issues to the people, that race neutrality is something that is politically popular. So, are set-asides working? Well, it depends on what you measure. If we think about contractor performance, that is, do minority-owned preferred group firms, do they perform differently than other firms? We find no difference, which suggests that there are no true hindrances to using minority-owned, women-owned, veteran-owned firms in the way that we often hear talked about in the broader discourse. Are these programs helping grow communities and build new firms? There are dozens of studies. Here are a few of them, but in general, the answer is yes. We're seeing that the investment in communities from government coffers creates new firms, creates new opportunities for people living in those communities, and generally improves the quality of life in those communities. But as you saw in the data before, we don't know why we're not attaining our equitable procurement goals. The raw data shows us that we're not, but we need more studies to explain why. If we have such persuasive evidence that community development is resulting, we need to make sure that we figure out why we're not attaining those goals, and because perhaps if we are attaining, or if we could attain those goals, we could do even better. There are some potential problems here. The first result revolves around administrative discretion. In these equity programs, the SBA and others, including procurement officers in every individual department and agency, retain the discretion to use these programs to determine who qualifies. And so Snyder et al., they find that the process of using SBA programs may lead to the selection of preferred firms that are sort of in the guise of preferred groups, right? So that is stronger firms, larger businesses that have relationships. They find evidence that people are essentially abusing their discretion. In my own work, I find evidence that when you try to figure out which values are guiding the behaviors of public procurement officials, that you see that it's actually performance rather than equity, and equity sort of is a sidelined value. You also see a lot of evidence that these SBA programs have rampant fraud, and the GAO has a series of studies on this where they find over and over again that hundreds of millions of dollars are being dedicated through SBA 8A programs and other programs that are not actually going to preferred group kinds of firms. Then finally, as we see the changes in the Hub Zone program, I worry about mission creep, and that is not to say that we shouldn't be investing in rural communities, but that if we pit rural communities against urban communities in a particular program like the Hub Zone program, that will water down the mission and will end up potentially losing sight of the initial goal, which was to promote growth in cities. If we want a rural procurement program, that's a great idea, but we should have a rural procurement program. One possible way that we can make an impact here is through changes to the federal workforce. So here is what you see broken down by racial representation, the effect of a 10% increase in representation on spending on new contracts with companies owned by that race. So we can see that if we hire more minority contracting officers, we hire more minority management analysts, pretty much across the board, that we result in greater spending with minority-owned firms. So this is potentially a bright light. With that, I will turn it over to Dafeng.
Thank you very much for the transition. And this is a paper about the US labor market. So, and this is a paper about the US labor market, and it's more like a macro level analysis related to the labor market and race, ethnicity, and social appetite. So, in particular, I focus on specifically on the trends in non-citizen workers in the United States during the COVID-19 pandemic. And as an overview of the main findings of this paper, and I observe a significant decline in the share of non-citizen workers in the US labor market last year. And there are several possible explanations, and I find that labor migration and work visa suspension play vital roles in shaping such trends. And while researchers also find that immigrants are disproportionately more likely to be unemployed during the pandemic, my results show that such unemployment shocks cannot explain a small proportion of trends in non-citizen workers in the labor market. And finally, the above results also shed light on post-pandemic economic recovery. And I find that the decline in non-citizen employment during the pandemic is associated with a decline in total workers in immigrant field occupations, which I will define in a few slides. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the background of this study. So this is a graph showing the ethnic composition in the US labor market by the Brookings Institute. So it shows that immigrants make up a significant part of the US labor force and actually have a disproportionately higher share of workers compared with their share in the entire population. And if you look at these two numbers. So this of course includes many non-citizen workers who have not obtained US citizenship or even permanent residency, but are still working in the US. And actually about half of all the immigrant workers are non-citizens, and many of them do not have the permanent residence. And later I will show that many immigrants work in specific occupations in which you can find this high concentration of immigrant workers and actually relatively fewer native-born workers. So it is very important to study trends in immigration workers' employment in the pandemic during the pandemic due to their contributions to the US economy. And many immigrant workers are non-citizens because, first of all, there is a lack of pathway to citizenship for many immigrants. And second, even for immigrants who have a clear pathway to citizenship, obtaining citizenship or even just permanent residency is far from trivial because there is a long waiting time for permanent residency and citizenship, and especially for immigrants from specific countries who need to wait for permanent residency for many years. And the proportion of such immigrants are really large in the US labor market right now. So basically, these immigrants need not only the work permit to reside in the United States, but also a work visa if they need to travel around, travel to another country. For example, if they need to travel back to their home country for family reasons, or travel to another country for work purposes, like a business trip or attending a conference. And many times, such a work visa is valid for only 1 year. So non-citizen workers need to apply for the visa at the US Embassy in another country if they need to travel abroad, which is apparently in the modern time very common. So in the last 4 years, US visa application has been notorious for its extremely long administrative processing time. But of course, applying for such a visa becomes even more difficult during the pandemic because many embassies in other countries are closed. This is a list of the so-called immigrant field jobs, or specifically jobs filled by non-citizen workers. So these numbers are the shares of non-citizens in that occupation, that jobs. And by the way, this is not a complete list, and there are some jobs where there are a lot of non-citizen workers, but I'm only showing a list of jobs of various types of industry, such as agriculture, services, medical, and high-tech, research and development. And again, this is not a complete list, but you can still see that these immigrant field occupations cover a wide range of fields, from agriculture to medical services, to information technology, to research in universities, etc., etc. So overall, in February last year, right before the pandemic, 7.2% of workers in the US labor market were non-citizens. So about half of the share of the immigrant workers in the United States. But there are many occupations where there are far more non-citizen workers, such as the occupations that I'm listing here. And many of them are actually closely related to COVID-19, as listed here, like medical workers, but also including some jobs that are not listed here, like life scientists and biologists, and many of whom are non-citizens in the United States. So, since non-citizen and employment in the United States is such an important policy relevant issue, and in this paper I studied the following questions. First, I described trends in the share of non-citizen workers in the United States and in the US labor market during the COVID-19 pandemic. And second, I investigate possible mechanisms or explanations behind the trends. And I finally discuss policy implications for social equity and the post-pandemic economic recovery. So in this paper, I used the current population survey monthly data last year from January to December. And the data are surveyed by the Census Bureau and is the best source to examine labor market dynamics in the US. The essential idea of the analysis is to compare non-citizen employment with citizens and before and after the pandemic. But of course, I will also study different statistical models to conduct further analysis from different perspectives to study the potential mechanisms behind the trends that we observe during the pandemic. So this is the baseline result. The x-axis here represents month from January to December, and here March serves as the benchmark month because this is when pandemic started and many labor market policies and immigration policies were implemented at the time. For example, visa policies. And labor market shocks also began there because in April, the US unemployment rate reached its historical peak for many years. And here, the dots are the coefficients in the statistical analysis that are the comparative analysis that shows the comparison between citizen and non-citizen employment in the labor market relative to this benchmark. That is the March labor market. And the bars here show the 95 confidence intervals. So before the pandemic, if we look at January and February, we find that the dots are very close to zero and actually insignificantly different from zero from the statistical perspective. Or in a plain language, this means that there was a relatively stable trend in non-citizen employment in the US labor market compared with citizens. But after the pandemic, and you can find that there is a sharp decline in non-citizen employment. And all the coefficients are negative and statistically significant. And effect sizes are also appear to be very large. And actually numerically, if you average all the coefficients here, you can find that the average effect is close to 0.9 percentage points. And if you remember that we talked about the fact that non-citizens took 7.2% of jobs in the US labor market in February. So this is approximately 13% of overall non-citizen employment before the pandemic. So this is quite sizable. And overall, this graph shows a sharp decline in the number of non-citizen workers in the United States. So then we would like to talk a little bit about the possible mechanisms, and many scholars talk about the unemployment shocks regarding immigrant employment. So for example, George Borjas and Hugh Cassidy point out that immigrants, and particularly non-citizens, are more likely to be unemployed during the COVID-19 pandemic because of the specific job skill types, or because of labor market discrimination, or because of just the general economic downturn, that employers are more likely to hire the native born workers and less likely to hire non-citizens. And the previous results are conditional on employed population. So the next question is, can the disproportionate unemployment effect of COVID-19 explain trends in non-citizen employment that we observe here? And in short, I conduct a back of the envelope calculation that shows that if the decline in non-citizen unemployment is fully because of the unemployment shocks, actually the above results can only be partially explained. So remember from the previous slides that overall there is a decline in non-citizens in the employed population by 0.9 percentage points. So the unemployment rate in April last year was about 15%, and this was quite high for the native-born workers as well, but was slightly higher for non-citizens even more. So, but if trends are completely due to the unemployment rate, the decline should be by 0.3 percentage points, or in other words, if we compare this number with 0.9 percentage points, actually the majority part of the decline in non-citizen unemployment cannot be explained by the unemployment shocks suggested by many scholars. So in this graph, which is a similar comparative analysis, I study work permit as a potential mechanism. And this is because of the observation that many immigrants, many non-citizens moved back to their home country or moved to other countries because of labor migration, because they need to take care of their family members in other countries because of the public health concerns in their countries, in their home country. But when they wanted to move back to the United States to resume their works, they could not because they need a visa to travel, but they could not because the US embassies were closed. And more specifically, I focus on the comparison between the two groups within the non-citizens. And I classify the non-citizens into two categories. One category is the so-called national interest exceptions, under which emergency appointment for visa application in US embassy is open. And another group contains workers that do not belong to the NIE, so the National Interest and Exceptions, abbreviated as NIE. So basically, NIE is related to emergency needs in the US labor market, such as medical services and life scientists. But many industries that are also crucial in the US economy are not identified as NIE. And last year, at the time, the policymakers argued that this, for another reason, was to protect the native-born workers and to protect them in the US labor market, because there were, as they said, there was just too many immigrant workers in the United States. So specifically, US embassies and consulates were closed during the pandemic, and there were global restrictions on non-citizens work permit under the previous administration. So national interest exceptions or NIE occupations are not affected. But as I have mentioned before, NIE only applies to very few occupations and usually requires strict administrative processing. So the processing time can be really long, even for NIE workers. And many NIE applications were simply just rejected because the visa officers thought that the jobs were not related to NIE. So in the previous slide, I showed that compared with NIE workers, there was a sharp decline in non-citizen workers in the labor market. And in fact, as I expected, there was no significant decline in non-citizen workers in NIE industries compared with citizens. It is just that the NIE occupations were really limited. So many non-citizen workers could not be back to the United States to resume their works. So such a decline in non-citizen workers in many industries finally translated into a major labor market problem in the United States last year. So this graph presents a similar comparative analysis, and it shows a sharp decline in the share of workers in the so-called immigrant field jobs, which are jobs with high shares of non-citizens. And about 20% of all jobs are the so-called immigrant field jobs. And in the first part of the presentation, I presented some examples like university professors, like medical workers, and also agricultural workers, as well as life scientists. So you can see that this covers a lot of different types of industries, different types of fields. So in other words, this graph shows that losing non-citizen workers actually leaves US jobs unfilled. So while last year, the US policymakers argued that such labor market and immigration policies were designed for protect native-born workers, it seems that it actually did not help the native-born workers, and eventually it hurt the US economy by leaving many US jobs unfilled. So to conclude this paper and provide some policy implications, I first discussed the economic impacts. And in this paper, I observed declining trends in non-citizen workers in the US labor market. And of course, non-citizen workers constituted a significant proportion of the US labor force. So this is kind of very serious issues, a very serious issue in the US labor market. And unemployment shocks can only explain a very small proportion of the trends. And restrictions on labor mobility, and in particular visa issues, play a key role. So such trends are associated with the decline in total workers in these immigrant-field occupations. And this is consistent with the classical findings in labor economics that non-citizens are actually complements, but not substitutes. And in other words, losing non-citizen workers leaves US jobs unfilled for various types of jobs in terms of skill requirements and industry, and also in terms of geography. And I also want to talk a little bit about equity issues for non-citizen workers to conclude this presentation. So many non-citizen workers left the United States for personal reasons, and they could not return to the US because of unemployment or losing work permit. But labor mobility is restricted simply due to visa issues, and non-citizen workers actually had a need to return to the US for work and also family reunion, because many of the non-citizens family members were in the United States and are also non-citizens, and including, for example, their kids and their parents. So the restrictions on labor migration also leads to serious equity issues for non-citizen workers as well. So this is the presentation, and thank you very much. And if you have any question, please feel free to contact me. Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us. I encourage you to visit the Evans School website to learn more about the work of my colleagues Ines, Ben, and Dafeng, as well as to learn about work by other students and faculty at the Evans School that explores the intersections of social infrastructure and public policy. Have a great day.